Some of us, when we think about water, and we think about being on the water, I wonder if we'd all agree. And I wonder maybe when's the last time you were on the water? It's been a while for me. But so many of us, when we think of being on the water, we have a stressful day. We go out at the end of the day. Some of you perhaps are on the water. You can do this. It's just a calming influence. You're like, yeah, it's been a long day, but what a beautiful scene. I'm glad to be out here. Some of you maybe have a long week. Come Saturday morning, you're out on the water fishing. And until you get really irritated because you don't catch anything, and initially it's a very calming experience, right, to be out on the water, say, oh gosh, I love getting away from it. Well, a lot of us would say, oh gosh, water, being on the water, does have a very calming effect. I think we understand that's not always the case. Meaning when a storm comes along, then the water becomes anything but peaceful. In fact, it becomes very, very chaotic. And I remind us of that for this reason, because that's the kind of chaos that Jesus steps into when at one point in his ministry, he reaches out to help some of his disciples. As we move into this today, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to look at this story of Jesus calming the storm. We're not going to look at it once. We're actually going to look at it twice. And here's why we're going to do that. Because we find this story told in two very, very different ways in two different Gospels. The Gospel of Mark, we'll look at that first, and then the Gospel of Matthew. And I want us to look at both of these stories today. There have been times when I've preached, I've focused on just one. But today I want you to see the key differences. I want you to see the contrast. Because we can learn so much from the differences here, especially related to who we are called to be when we face storms in life, because they will come. So first today, let's take a look at the Gospel of Mark. If you want to follow along, this will be up on the screens, but if you want to follow along in your Bible, on your phone, we're going to turn to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, we'll start with verse 35, read through 41. So first, here is the story about Jesus calming a storm. Here it is according to the Gospel of Mark. This is, first off, the bad example we find in Scripture. I don't want to ruin anything for you, but here's the bad example of how to deal with storms in life. Mark 4:35. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said this to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Already, I hope you're irritated with the disciples today. A little bit, and according to Mark here. "Teacher, don't you care about us?" It says, Jesus got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Jesus then said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this?" What? Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Now, with each of these stories today, we'll do the same with Matthew. With each of these stories, here's what we're going to focus on. We're going to look at the path that the disciples take in that particular story in light of the storm that arises. And so notice the progression here initially in Mark. For example, notice what the disciples do first when the storm comes upon them, because this is pretty amazing, but also, I think, pretty pathetic. You might agree. What they do first when the storm comes upon them is this. Instead of coming to Jesus to simply say, "Jesus, we got a problem. We know you love us. We know you can take care of things like this. We trust in you. Would you help us?" Instead of starting there, here's what they do first in the midst of the storm. They find him, they wake him up, and they accuse him of not caring about them. Accusation is what they turn to initially, his disciples. So first, remember we're talking progression here. First, according to Mark, we have the disciples acting in this way. I don't like it. Perhaps you don't like it either as we get into this. But then here's what happens nonetheless. As things progress, we then have this. In spite of the disciples' actions, we find Jesus nonetheless responding to that by calming this storm. Meaning now, in many ways, he takes action that disproves what they've just said about him, right? That he doesn't care. So the disciples complain, Jesus calms the storm. And then here's the final piece of this according to Mark, also pretty pathetic. Having been saved by him, no other way to say it, the disciples now respond to Jesus by doing this. They are terrified of him, and because of that fear, what they bring to him now can only be described as this. It's a disbelief. It's a complete lack of faith. Guys, here's the deal. Often when we face storms in life, I know it can be this way for me, and I bet it's the same for most of you. And we need to really be honest about this, to offer this to God as a confession, to say, oh yeah, God, I get stuck in this sometimes. Lest we judge the Markan disciples too strongly, the ones we find in this story and how they react. Often in our lives as well, at the first sign of facing a storm, we too can initially come to God in order to say, God, why don't you care about me? Why have you allowed this into my life? Illness, financial problem, loss of job, marriage problems. God, why don't you care about me? It's easy for us as human beings from time to time, easy for us to start there when something big hits us. Problem with that is when we start there, like the disciples here in Mark, then even when God does calm our storm somehow, whether that's calming our storm kind of literally on the outside, taking care of something we're dealing with in that sense, or just calming us within, we'll talk more about that at the end. When we start with this sense of why God, then often, even when God does take action in our lives, we, like the disciples, begin to think, I'm not sure this was God intervening in my life. I'm not sure this was God really making things better. Maybe things just resolved on their own. And the best way to describe that response, same way we described it for the disciples, it's disbelief. It's a lack of faith, the kind of faith we all want to have. It's why we're here today. First, looking at this story today in the Gospel of Mark, I simply want you to do this. I want you to think about times when you have, in fact, followed that path. Maybe you're on that path right now. No judgment, just process this then. I want you to think about a time when you've been on this path of complaint and doubt. I want to kind of describe it that way, complaint and doubt. And as you think about a time when you were on that path, ask yourself two questions. One, what took you there? Or what tends to take you to that particular path, complaint and doubt? But then ask yourself this question as well. What can best help you to get off that path when you find yourself there? What can best help you to get out of that pattern of thinking when you find yourself there? Because you know as well as I do, that's not where we want to be when we're facing storms in life. We know it's not where Jesus wants us to be. Bad example, now let's look at the flip side of that. Thank goodness we have a very different story, same but different, in the Gospel of Matthew. As I read this, listen to the differences. Very important. Here now is Matthew chapter 14. Again, if you want to follow along, but this will be up on the screens. Matthew chapter 14. We're going to start with verse 22. It says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. There are some differences here that I don't want you to focus on too much, because again, he's not with them yet in the Matthean text. There are other elements that I want you to focus on, more the similarities in the story, but then they involve the disciples behaving differently in the midst of those things that are similar. Again, the storm, how they respond to Jesus when he takes action, those kinds of things. So first, very much a difference in that Jesus isn't with them initially. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land. Remember, we talked about the sea being 13 by 8, right? So there's a lot of space out there as they're trying to get to the other side. The boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." And now we journey into the similarities. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, in other words, when he began to focus again on the storm, it says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out. Okay? Doesn't cry out, "Why don't you love me?" Cries out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat, hear this, they worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now let's make the same journey here, just in a different story. So notice first here what the disciples do according to Matthew at the first sign of this storm. And guys, Peter here represents the disciples as a whole. So think of it that way. Notice what Peter does here first in terms of the path he takes when he gets overly focused on the storm. He asks Jesus for help, right? He makes a request of him using these few words, very simply saying, "Lord, save me." And while absolutely we know there is still fear and doubt in him, right, which is understandable, the key for him here, though, is this. And this is what we need to learn from him. The key here is this, that fear, that doubt that any of us would feel, because of his crying out, "Lord, save me," because of his making this request, that fear and doubt don't last very long. That fear and doubt do not continue to bog him down, right? So the first step here for Matthew, and this is very different than what we find in Mark. The first step here for Matthew is Peter making this request of Jesus. The second step then is the same as Mark. Jesus calms the storm. But then here's the last step on Matthew's path, so to speak. How the disciples now respond to what Jesus has done. Meaning now that the storm has been calmed, so different than what we find in Mark. Now that the storm has been calmed, what do they now offer to him? Here's what they do, hear this. The disciples now worship him. Simple as that. No astonishment, no lack of understanding, no further fear. Instead, they simply worship him, and then as importantly, they also do this. Think about it this way. They affirm their faith, and they affirm their faith with these words, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Again, very, very different path here in Matthew. So now with this image before you, now with the good example before you, I simply want you to do a similar thing to what we just did. I want you to now think about times when you indeed have followed this path, Think about the times you have moved from complaint and doubt, and you've been able to embrace request and praise, request and affirming your faith. Think about times that you found yourself on this path and then ask the same questions. One, what tends to take you there? But then even more importantly, two, ask yourself this as well. What could best help you to almost always end up there? What could best help you to more consistently, at the first sign of a storm in your life, what could best help you to more consistently end up on this path? Requesting God's help because you know He wants to help and it will come. And then when it comes, with all your heart, affirming your faith as that storm subsides. As you journey into another week, as you journey into even just this afternoon, I really want to encourage you to take a look at the questions that you find at the bottom of today's insert. Even if you didn't fill in blanks, even if you didn't move through it, consider the questions that you find here. Because when we think about what we've just learned through these contrasting stories, I know this will be helpful if we move through it. First question is kind of something like this. Start with the basics. How do you respond to the storms in life, mostly? Right now in your life, what kind of is your default when a storm arises in your life? And then you've got to ask yourself, kind of, how's that working for you? And are there changes you want to make? I do hope as you think about right now kind of your default response when the storms arise, I hope as you think about changes you absolutely want to make in that, hope you'll think about what we find here in Matthew. And I hope with God's help you can much more consistently be drawn into this sense of request because you know He loves you and wants to help. This sense of request and praise, request and worship. How are you currently responding to life's storms? And if it's not entirely that way, what changes might you make with God's help? Second question might sound like an odd question, but it's so important for us to ask this. What happens if, or how might we react to a situation where God absolutely calms the storm within us? And I mean, we know it's God. We feel that inner peace. I mean, we are worshiping and praising. Problem is that outward storm continues to rage on. Best example of that, and some of you have dealt with this, you're diagnosed with a serious illness. That serious illness doesn't go away immediately, can't go away immediately because of your situation. When you know God has calmed your storm within and that that's what matters most, are there times 2 months later, 3 months later, 4 months later, that you see the waves crashing around you again and that takes that peace away for all of us, not knowing when we might face that? What's it going to take for us to continue to embrace the resolution of that storm, even though for a time it's only within us? But then a last question is this, and I want to push you on this. I want you to just joyfully have some fun with this and think about this. What are some specific ways you can worship Him, you can affirm your faith when He calms a storm in your life? And here's what I mean by that. Guys, don't settle for, I think that's resolved in my life. God, I think you did that. Thank you. And then you move on with whatever comes next in your day. Let's go a little deeper, but you got to think about that ahead of time. Some of you might say, good point, good thought. You know what I'm going to start doing? And in fact, you may have just come through a storm that He's calmed. Maybe you'll do it this afternoon. You might say, every time that I find God working in my life in this way, I'm going to call this certain friend. I'm going to just say, let me tell you what God just did. What a great way to affirm our faith to another. Maybe you've got someone in your life who's dealing with something similar. And you're thinking, God, one of the ways I want to affirm my faith, I want to praise you as you've calmed my storm. I want to call them, offer a testimony to them so that perhaps they might look to you. Rather than them being caught up in complaint and doubt, they'll embrace request, and you can bring healing and hope and a calm to their lives. Or maybe you might just say, I realize now, Pastor, I do come to church more consistently to say, Lord, save me. Maybe I need to come more often to say, I praise you, God. You have taken care of me as I have cried out to you. So maybe for you, you're thinking today, man, I got to affirm my faith better by just being here every Sunday. Guys, that's not an advertisement. That really is just pray about that and think about that. This can matter so much. Storms in life are going to come, aren't they? You know, I think in some ways, as I think about what some of you have dealt with, you are dealing with, man, I feel like at times I haven't dealt with much. Some of you have dealt with some serious things. Storms in life will come big or small. When they come, big or small, the good news is we've always got a choice we can make. Will we descend into complaint and doubt? As human beings, doesn't mean we're terrible, but it does mean we got to rethink things if that's what we usually descend into. I pray that having dealt with what we've dealt with today, more often than not when the storms come, we might embrace request and praise, request and worship, request and affirmation of faith. Let's pray.